Okay, we'll make a start. So welcome to the Manton Centre for British Art, generously funded by the Manton Foundation. I'm Steve Edwards and I'm the Centre's Director. The Centre coordinates research on British art at Courtauld, organises research events, lectures, workshops, conferences and other gatherings. So please do keep your eye on our website for things that are forthcoming. Tonight we have a book launch for Andy Friend's new volume, Comrades in Art, Artists Against Fascism, 1933 to 1943, published by Thames and Hudson, and we're especially grateful to Roger Thorpe and Thames and Hudson for their sponsorship of this event. Many of you may know the Artists International Association, but if you don't, let me just say that the AIA was a major feature of 20th century British art, with a membership in the region of 1,000 people. Perhaps its greatest achievement was to unite factions and trends, figurative painters, social realists, abstract artists, and surrealists in opposition to fascism that was then, as now, overwhelming democracy in Europe. In this sense, it's clearly facilitated by the Popular Front. And given our context, it's worth observing that the first director of the Courtauld, William Constable, was a supporter of the association, and that Anthony Blunt, who was to serve as the third director, was an active participant during the 1930s. Yet this major formation, with obvious lessons for today, has been largely overlooked by art historians. On the one hand, formalists and connoisseurs have found the work aesthetically uninspiring, and on the other, so-called postmodernists have eagerly moved on from the politics associated with the AIA and the 30s anti-fascism. To my knowledge, there's been no serious engagement with the AIA since the interest of the 1980s. In 1983, Linda Morris and Robert Radford curated the exhibition at what was then the Museum of Modern Art in Oxford, on the Artists International Association, and just a few years later, Robert Radford published a short book. The result has been a 40-year historiographic hiatus, and as such, we're extremely fortunate, I think, to have this scrupulously researched study, almost 350 pages of it, very lavishly and beautifully produced, to initiate a new assessment and overdue reckoning with this important formation. Let me just say a few things about Andy before I hand over to him. Andy Friend is far from a typical historian of art. He studied English at Cambridge before becoming active in community politics and working for the Greater London Council during the 1980s. After the Thatcher government closed the GLC, he became chief executive for the City of Melbourne, and on returning to the UK, he served as chief executive of the construction group John Laing plc. This is Andy's third book with Thames and Hudson. In 2017, he published Revilius & Co., The Pattern of Friendship, and curated the Associated Tower Gallery touring exhibition that was seen by 100,000 people. This was followed in 2020 by John Nash, The Landscape of Love and Solace, and again, a co-curated accompanying tower exhibition. Alongside the current book, Andy has organised the display Artists International, the first decade, which is on show in Tate Britain's Mary Louise von Maciejewski Archive Gallery until March the 26th. For those who haven't seen that exhibition, there's still time yet, and we encourage you to go. So that's all I have to say, and I'm going to hand over to Andy, who's going to talk about the Artists International Association. So join with me in thanking Andy.
I think I should really be clapping all of you for coming out tonight, and thank you for being here. It's great to see you all. Because it's Halloween, I couldn't resist but starting with this photograph, which was taken on Halloween night 87 years ago, less than a mile away from here. Actually, Halloween in 1937 fell on a Sunday, and the AIA liked to party on Saturday night, so it may have been last night, the equivalent photograph. But on the right is somebody probably none of you have heard of. He's a guy called Leo Wyatt. He trained industrial apprenticeship in the old Kent Road, went on to be a designer of printers' dies and copperplate, not far away from here. And by 1937, he'd studied at the Central School and was a sort of self-employed designer, and came along as obviously as Hitler that night. And he stands in, I think, for, there were probably about 800 members of the IAA by the time this photograph was taken, and probably 150, 200 of them came from a similar sort of trade, craft, art background, but also many, many fine artists involved by then. Not quite sure who the woman in the mask is, but the person on the left is Misha Black, who was 4 years into his 11 years chairing with great strategic adeptness first the Artists International British section and then the AIA. And it was taken in the rooms that an artist called Cliff Rowe had near Queen Square. And I think it was probably taken by him because there is an album which says it was in his flat. He doesn't feature in any of the images on the roll of film. And therefore it unites in Cliff Rowe and Misha Black, the two people whose contact in 1933 was absolutely crucial to the beginnings of this extremely impressive radical organisation. Cliff's rooms were above a fish restaurant called Schiavati's Fish Restaurant, which was actually the mise en scène for a painting he had completed the year before, which is an extraordinary political allegory of the situation as the left perceived it, the organised left perceived it at the beginning of 1936. And I'll return to that a bit later. The photograph I was going to begin with, before I realised that tonight was Halloween night and you'd all be missing your trick or treating, was this one. Because as Steve has already mentioned, W.G. Constable was a supporter of the AIA and an important one. This is a photograph taken in the Conway Hall at Red Lion Square, again not far away from here, on late in the afternoon of April the 25th, 1937. So less than 18 hours before the Condor Legion, as a birthday present for Hitler, destroyed Gernika in the Basque country. This was a closing session of something called the British Artists Congress. And here we have Herbert Reed, Constable, Misha, Lord Hastings, who sometime assistant to Diego Rivera doing murals in the US. Quentin Bell, younger son of Vanessa Bell and Clive Bell, sporting a sort of hipster beard, who's delivering a report about art education to the closing session of the British Artists Congress. And this is Ronald Kidd, who is the founder of the National Council of Civil Liberties, and then that was an important organisational ally of the AIA. I first came across the AIA story. Steve mentioned that my entry into this art history world was writing a book called Revilius & Co, The Pattern of Friendship. And that was a book that took Revilius as the central subject, but was really about the network within which he existed, how some lesser known people now had been clearly influential on some of the bigger names now. And one of the things that, so as a group biography, it required me to delve a bit into the lives of each of the individuals in that network. And what struck me, and the sort of periphery of my vision while I was doing that book, was that all of them, bar two of the names on this list, Enid Marks and Douglas Percy Bliss, had been active and in some cases considerable activists within the build-up of the AIA. So that, for example, Percy Horton was on the AIA Central Committee throughout the 30s. Paul Nash was a key supporter. Edward Borden had joined the Peace Publicity Bureau, which the AIA set up in 1935. And while researching that book, I came across a letter from Revilius to his soon-to-be ex-lover, Helen Binion. And it was clear that she was sitting on the door at the exhibition which accompanied the British Artists Congress, collecting threepences or whatever it was to go into the exhibition. And Ravilius says, oh, I've read all the resolutions, we're coming to the plenary sessions, we're going to the public meeting, we being him and his wife, Terza Garwood. Now, Ravilius was not the most organised politico in the world, but this sounded all the world like a sort of 1970s, 1980s trade union conference. Out of that project came a project to write about John Nash, seen here on the left with his brother Paul Nash. And it turned, while researching that, I came across Christine Kuhlenthal's journal, who was his wife, John Nash's wife, and it turned out that John's affair with Helen Binion, John being the next sort of cab off the rank in Helen's amorous adventures in the late 30s, had started at a studio party associated with the British Artists Congress, raising funds for Spanish medical aid. So all these things began to add up. I was beginning to think there's an interesting story here. And then very shortly after reading that in the journal, I was walking through Cecil Court, which connects St Martin's Lane and in Theatreland with Charing Cross Road. And there in a bookshop was, a closed up bookshop, in the window was this poster for the British Artists Congress. And two things immediately struck me about it. One was that it had been folded up to go in an A4 envelope and presumably dispatched as part of the build-up propaganda and advertising for it. But secondly, looking at it, was looking at them, it was published in the January, I think, before the Congress in the April. What struck me was the breadth and depth of the coalition of quite well-known names, that this group of students who started from a standing start with no resources 4 years before, students and ex-students, to build up this organisation, had accumulated around their project by this point. So you had Stanley Badman, a topographical artist, John Banting becoming a surrealist, James Bateman, an RA, Vanessa Bell, Chimaev, an architect, Professor Constable, Jacob Epstein, whose statuary around London was being daubed by the British Union of Fascists at this point in history, Eric Gill, Stephen Duncan Grant, Nina Gray, who was the leading partner in the Industrial Design Partnership by then, Barbara Hepworth, John Maynard Keynes, fund manager and economist at this point, David Lowe, who was the most important popular cartoonist, regularly denounced by both Hitler and Mussolini, actually, for his cartoons at that time, Henry Moore, Paul Nash, Mahoney Nige, Ben Nicholson, the sort of poster child of artistic sectarianism at that time, Ravilius Reid, Frank Rutter, who actually died 4 days before this Congress opened, but was a very well-known writer and critic about art at the time. Sir Michael Sadler, former Vice-Chancellor of Leeds University, now I think at an Oxbridge College, but a big collector of British art. Edward Wadsworth, who was one of the artists who selected the abstract art that went into the accompanying exhibition. So those three things, the two letters in this poster, got me thinking about the AIA. And unless the first, the platform photograph, which had W.G. Constable in misleads, I put this one up because the AIA was also an organisation with a very strong participation from women in it, and key women were a party to its growth. Margaret Fitton, married to James Fitton, who was one of the key founders, and Nan Youngman here, and Elizabeth Wilson there. At that meeting that I was talking about on the day before Gernika. This timeline, which is on the back of some bookmarks that are available here, if anybody hasn't got one, to pick one up now, gives the sort of the time that the book we're launching covers. And I'm going to talk in the balance of this talk just about 5 kind of key episodes within that. The founding story, what happened in 1935 in Soho Square, which was in a sense the sort of coming out party where it moved from being quite a small organisation to a much better known one. the Grosvenor Square Congress, exhibition that accompanied the Artist Congress, one that took place at Whitechapel just before, while the Spanish Republic was collapsing and when war was beginning to feel inevitable in the spring of 1939, and then one that took place on the John Lewis bomb site in 1943. So the origin story has a lot to do with the guy who's on the left of this photograph taken in 1928. He's a guy called Cliff Rowe, working class background from Wandsworth, mother died young, he ran pretty wild in the streets, not a great attender at school, I suspect, goes to art classes at Wimbledon Art College, gets to the Royal College of Art, but only lasts 2 terms because he's far too challenging a character for William Rothenstein, the then principal. He begins to make his way as a painter and is associated with the Hurricane Lamp Gallery, which existed for 3 or 4 years in Chelsea. And on the right is a pamphlet, which is also absolutely central to the foundation of the AIA. I suspect he met Misha Black, who was working, constructing and designing trade show stands at Olympia during that activity, or possibly because they both lived in the Covent Garden area. So he was making his way as a painter. He exhibited in the Courtauld Gallery and places like that. This painting on the right, the Hurricane Lamp Gallery had a sort of coterie of people like the young Sybil Thorndike, various poets and so on, who were part of a sort of salon there. Aldous Huxley was a member of that group, and I think this is a previously unrecognized painting of portrait of Aldous Huxley, which will be in the Tower exhibition next year. The Invergordon Mutiny took place in September 1931. It was the most substantial revolt against British military authority since Spithead and the Nore during the French Revolutionary Wars in the 1790s. So consequential was it that it took place on Tuesday, Wednesday. On Thursday, there was a run on the stock market. On Friday, there was a run on the pound. On Sunday, before the papers went to print, for Monday morning, the Treasury was briefing Fleet Street that Britain was coming off the gold standard, which is something that had been likely for quite a while, but had not happened. So very consequential in terms of the confidence of the ruling group in the UK. Cliff would have illustrated this in the first couple of months of 1932. And at that point, he was having an affair with an older woman, a woman called Dr. May Tilney Miles, who was a kind of slightly pioneering GP in Wandsworth. And all was going swimmingly for them until aggrieved hubby cited Cliff in the beginnings of divorce proceedings. And at that point in 1932, if you were kind of reasonably progressive and thinking about what was happening here, the contrast between the apparently unalloyed progress that was going on in Moscow. Moscow Metro was opening, literacy was going up, industrialization, we had to be working under the 5-year plan. Nobody knew much about the famine in Ukraine at that point. Here we have 25% unemployment, benefits are being cut. The Economic Conference called to get over the impact of tariffs in the global trading system was failing, as was the League of Nations Disarmament Conference in Lausanne. So the contrast was quite big, and so quite a lot of young people were quite interested in what's going on in the Soviet Union. And quite a rather lesser number of people actually went to see, but it was possible so to do at the time. And you could go down, you could either get a visa from Intourist, or you could go to something called the Society for Cultural Relations between the Peoples of British Commonwealth and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Its successor still has an office in Brixton Road, by the way, in quite an interesting library. This had been set up in 1924 during the first Labour government, when the Zinoviev letter, the big daddy of fake news, designed to destroy the electoral chances of the Labour Party, was published. And it was set up by quite an interesting group. You can see Ian Forster, Julian Huxley, Aldous' brother, Keynes himself, H.G. Wells, Virginia Woolf, who remained a vice president of this organisation up to her death in March 1941. And Leonard Woolf, down here on the executive committee, did, I think, quite a bit of the work in the setting up of this. So you could go and you could get a visa to go to the Soviet Union, and quite a lot of people went in parties. You got on a boat at Tower Bridge, you went through the Kiel Canal, you landed up in St. Petersburg, you got on the train and went to Moscow. And this is what May and Cliff did. And they arrived there, but you could only stay in Moscow for your allotted 7 days, 10 days, 2 weeks. And on the penultimate day they were there, and the reason why you could only stay there was that there was a severe housing shortage in the middle of 1932. You could only stay if you had a job, and you could only get a job as a foreigner if you already had accommodation. So it was a sort of cleft stick controlling the housing shortage. On the last day, before they have to leave, Cliff is wandering around the streets, and he looks up, and there's a sign in Russian, English beneath it, which says Foreign Workers Publishing Co-op. And he goes in, and on the wall is, I think, a poster-sized version of the pamphlet he has designed in London. And he says, I did that. And they say, you did that, you're hired. And he works there for the next 18 months, making things like the protection of labour in the USSR look slightly more attractive than they otherwise would be. But I particularly like his use of photo montage in making exciting the progress of the first business accounting brigade. Anyway, so he's been there about 6 weeks, and he gets called to 6 or 7 weeks. He gets called to a meeting, which is the organising committee of an exhibition that is going to take place the following year in 1933 to commemorate the 15th anniversary of the foundation of the Red Army. Stalin is on this organising committee. History doesn't record whether he actually attended any of the meetings, but what they want is all the foreign artists who are in Moscow to do something about the quote-unquote class struggle in their country. And it's a humongous Russian exhibition. I think and there is actually somebody who's a bit of an expert on it in the room, but I think there were 700 to 900 Russian artists who participated in this in a much smaller foreign section. Cliff is seeing bundles of the Daily Worker coming into the office of the Foreign Workers Publishing Co-op from London. And what they're reporting in those weeks are the arrival of the hunger marches at the end of October, beginning of November 1932, when there was 10 days of fighting around central London between the Metropolitan Police and the hunger marches. It took place in St. George's Circus. A 1 million signature petition from the distressed areas was confiscated at Charing Cross Station and never seen again. A rally in Hyde Park was attacked by mounted police. There was fighting in Trafalgar Square. So pretty consequential events, which were the direct cause of the foundation of the National Council of Civil Liberties in this country. So Cliff is seeing all these newspaper reports, and he takes them and he amalgamates them into a large image, which is a mural on canvas. It's 3.5 meters long by 1.5 meters high. And you can trace the various incidents that are in the Daily Worker reports to things that are happening in this image. So it's kind of a bit influenced by Diego Rivera, I think, who had visited a few years before to Moscow. This incident, for example, takes place in St. George's Circus. There's a black and white photograph in the Daily Worker. And Cliff, I think, as a sort of wry joke, has put a self-portrait into it, because the first 2 years of the social realism instructions to Soviet artists had been having dire results, and just about this time they issued new instructions which said that the artist must see themselves as part of the struggle. So I think he's actually put this self-portrait in as a sort of wry comment. He never sees that pending again, and I'll come back at the end to where it is now and our chances of seeing it, but it's been recently rediscovered. Why it is so important for the foundation of the AIA is to do this painting. He is working alongside Japanese and Chinese artists who are working together jointly in precisely the weeks that Manchuria is being invaded by Hirohito's army. So think Srebrenica in the 1990s. Think the massacres that we know of that have gone on in various wars. That was what was going on. They were the series of events that began to shred the credibility of the League of Nations as a peacekeeping force. But he's immensely struck by this. He writes this letter back to Misha, who's in Covent Garden, and says, when I get back to London, we must found an organisation amongst artists against fascism, because the ability of artists to work across the boundaries of national hatred is very important. And so that was the kind of emotional force that led him to write that letter. Before he leaves Moscow and comes back, he meets this woman, Pearl Binder, better known in the modern era as Lady Elwyn Jones, because she married an anti-fascist lawyer who went on to be the Lord Chancellor in the Callaghan government. Pearl came from Jewish heritage background, immigrant background in Manchester. She left school early. She worked as a clerk in a mill. She goes to Manchester Art College, where she develops a good line in satirical drawing. She then comes down and lives in Guildford Street, not far away from here, and develops her career initially as a book illustrator. You meet them in all the Bloomsbury Squares. She had a sort of slightly good satirical eye, I think, a little stretchy here, and stood around at studio parties talking about it. Art, that is, a woman carrying art by Clive Clell, which is clearly Clive Bell. Her view was that she couldn't quite understand why these quite upper class people were slumming it when she'd actually knew what slum conditions were. But she had a 2-year marriage to a guy called Jack Dryburgh, who was an anthropologist at the LSE, who's much older. That broke up. She moves to Whitechapel, where she does her, and based on her experience there, she's becoming a very good lithographer. This is called the Bell Foundry. It's in a book of London lives she did called Odd Jobs. This one is the bookshop in Wentworth Street, and it was in a book called The Realist East End that she illustrated. She was in Moscow because she similarly had got a backpack, a Macintosh and her lithographs, and she went off on the boat in the hope of exhibiting there, which she did actually. And so she meets Cliff and says, that is a great idea about this organisation. When I get back to London, I will support its formation. She went 3 times, the last time for 6 months, to the Soviet Union during the 1930s. And this is one of her lithographs, Russian train journey. You can see the suitcase with Leningrad on it from her last journey. She had learned her lithography at the Central School of Arts and Crafts, which was much more accessible to people than the Royal College of Art or obviously the Academy schools or whatever. And there, the class had been taken over by James Fitton, also a Mancunian from a working class background. Father was a blacklisted trade unionist who led a strike there. He had come down to London, and he had met Margaret Fitton, seen here at the Artists' Congress 7 years later. This is, I think, was about 1929-30 when they first got together. She's really interesting because, I don't know whether, yes, so he was establishing himself as a painter, and that here's one of the only names, I think the only name on that yellow poster I showed of the key supporters, who is from this initial group of 15, 20 people who start the organisation. And it reflects the fact that he, for example, in 1930, he exhibited at the Royal Academy, he exhibited at the New English Art Club, he exhibited with the London group. So he was establishing himself as a painter, but also as a good lithographer, and that's why he had taken over the class at the Central School from a man called A.S. Hartrick, and he was a very good designer. he said, I did a poster which had a touch of Leger and Kandinsky, he wrote about, which is, I think that one. But Margaret Fitz is a very good example, I think, of how, it doesn't matter how good you are as an artist, and particularly as a woman artist, that if your work dips below the kind of horizon line of public market and curatorial consciousness, it can take quite a lot to recover it. So her paintings were picked out by Anthony Blunt, among other people, in one of his reviews of an AIA exhibition in the 1930s. There isn't a single picture of hers in a British public collection. We've put 4 in the Thames and Hudson book, and there will be 9 at the Town next year. They mainly all exist in 2-family houses in South London, but she's quite a considerable painter. So when Pearl comes back, she goes to the photography class and she says, Cliff's just got back from Moscow, we need to go down to Misha's flat and find out what he's got to say. And that was the first of 2 meetings that took place, I think, a fortnight apart from each other, which eventually involved 20 people, 13 people at the first meeting and 20 at the second. This founding group were all really united by, I think, 3 things. One was age. They were nearly all in their 20s, apart from 3 people, one of whom was 16-year-old Edith Simon, who did this self-portrait, who was a refugee from Berlin already, and was invited along to the second meeting because she could type. So they were united by their age. They were all united by the fact that they had been making progress as, in modern parlance, young creatives, up until the backwash from the 1929 financial crash and the subsequent slump. So if you're a fine artist, a young fine artist, you found the galleries were becoming much more conservative. Collectors were in retreat because they lost a lot of their money. If you were a commercial artist, the line for the job and the rate for the job, the line was becoming longer and the rate was going down. So people were feeling the economic pressure. But the other thing that united them, partly because there were 3 people from overseas, from continental Europe, Edith Simon, Laszlo Perry, Peter Laszlo Perry, and Hans Feibusch were the 3 people in that group. They were all, for various reasons, already political exiles. And that's Peter Laszlo Perry, who had Hungarian background, constructivist design, worked for the Berlin architects department, began to do sculpture, had to leave very suddenly after the Nazis got into power when his English wife was picked up carrying CP literature. They came to London. And Hans Feibusch, who came at the same time from Berlin. And so what united them was, even 9 months after Hitler had got into the Chancellery, was a shared awareness of the depth of the evil that was beginning to unfold in Central Europe. So that became their sort of founding motivation. We must do something. And that something was not forming an artist group in order to advance a particular line of art. And it wasn't really to improve, certainly to improve their position within the market. It was a lot about using their skills collectively to support progressive causes. And this one, for example, is one of the first things that Cliff did when he got back, was this poster for the Cambridge Student Anti-War exhibition that was being put together. And I think there's a clue here as to how they saw themselves. Just down here, I don't know whether you can see it, it says Row AI. They weren't aspiring to be RAs, they were seeing themselves as AIs. And he also did this cover for the Hunger March cartoons. I think some people in this room would have used a Gestetner machine in the earlier days, which was the business machine of choice in the 30s, prevented you having to go off to the printers. They produced at that central school class a series of cartoons to meet the next Hunger March, which arrived in January 1934, so just 3 months after they were set up. This one, I think, is by Edward Ardizoni. It's his unmistakable style. It's unsigned. It reflects the fact that the national government was introducing into Parliament legislation, a new unemployment bill, which would provide for the setting up of labour camps along the lines of the German ones where the long-term unemployed could be sent. So, you know, ladies and gentlemen, the working classes will now jump through the hoop. The Hunger March, they were coming down for a Congress of Action. This was the proposal for the labour camps. But I just want to talk a little bit about this one. It's by a guy called Roy Laurier. I've only ever found one other piece of work of his, which is a cartoon in Left Review in the following year, satirising the Jubilee. But it is, I think, a brilliant piece of the moment political cartooning. Ramsay MacDonald had split the Labour Party, was still the Prime Minister in the National Government. Here he is sitting on the throne of government. Next to him is Stanley Baldwin, about to take over as Prime Minister, former Conservative Prime Minister, about to be the Prime Minister. His hands are on the levers of power, controlling the Whitehall machine, producing this new legislation, which was going to force local authorities to cut benefits in order to fuel armaments expenditure. And behind Hitler and Mussolini with Mosley for future enlargement. And the strapline, it's a fascist scheme, which may seem a bit sort of Dave Spark-like until you realise that this was done in the week that the Daily Mail was calling for Mosley, Farage-like, to be installed, notwithstanding the arithmetic in Parliament, as to sort out the crisis. And Harold Harmsworth, the proprietor, wrote a signed reader calling for this. He, of course, was very pro-Hitler, as the holiday slap on the right shows. The other thing that was going on at this time, and this is by Edith Tudor Hart, who, as Edith Shishitsky, had to come after the Dollfuss coup back to Britain. She'd been excluded before, but she married a guy called Adam Tudor Hart in the embassy in Vienna and was able to get back into the country. It's called Sedition. It was exhibited at the first exhibition. It's rather wonderful because I think it's taken just at the moment that the not-so-secret policeman on the right realises there's a young woman with a camera pointed at him. And it reflected the fact that the other piece of legislation going into Parliament at this time was something called the Sedition Bill, which was going to, in the aftermath of the Invergordon Mutiny, make it give police powers of entry and seizure and make it illegal to be in possession of literature which, if placed in the hands of a serving soldier or sailor, might cause them to question orders. Well, clearly this embraces the Bible, all of Shakespeare, most of English literature. And there was, not surprisingly, a big campaign against it. It was passed in modified form. But this photograph is called Sedition. And it immediately becomes a trope for the cartoonists who have just set up Left Review, which includes those. So that's by James Boswell, who'd come from New Zealand and was appalled. New Zealand in the 1920s and 30s was a much more pure white, a much more egalitarian society than Britain. And when he came to the Royal College of Art, he was appalled at the way the upper classes were treating the unemployed, basically. So you've got to have blue blood, a nice piece of Fisher's glass satire on the left. His big mate was a guy called James Holland, who came from a waterside background in the East End, went on to be the designer of the floating bit of the Festival of Britain after the war. That's called the Sailor's Return. And I think it's, this deckhand is back, he's been laid off, he's in the East End. So they were very much focused in their first 2 years on how do we support these clauses, how do we use our skills as artist and designer to support the campaigns and so on. But then in 1935, a very significant set of developments happens during this year. And they have a lot to do with the contribution that this woman on the left, Betty Ree, made, I think. Betty Ree was, she'd been at the Royal College of Art for a couple of years. She was in the sculpture group, which was only 11 people out of 400, but included Henry Moore, and she was close to Henry Moore. She'd been there for 2 years, and she came from an upper class family sort of pressure had her leave. She was presented at court. She married James Ree, who was a sort of minor aristocrat and not very good barrister and a bit of a drunkard, I think. And that's them on the steps of St. Martin's when they get married in 1926, I think. He has lots of affairs, she has lots of affairs, they have 2 boys. By 1935, they are splitting up. She takes the quite courageous step of moving out of their family mansion in Belgravia, which I think had 11 servants living in it with them, to a flat in Notting Hill with her 2 boys by herself. And that's some of her early work, which she'd been doing, and you can see if you know Henry Moore's work, the influence that he had on her. So 1935 is the Jubilee year, and were the centrepiece, which was the year that the populace was giving thanks for everything that the monarch had done for the populace in the previous 25 years. And the centrepiece of it was a massive church service of Thanksgiving at St. Paul's, which took place on Sunday, May the 6th. And that was preceding it was a procession from Buckingham Palace to St. Paul's. But when London woke up that morning, the route had been fly-posted with this poster by the AIA. But they made a very simple, almost naive mistake. Printed and published by the Artists International Association in 9 Arundel Gardens, London, W11, the address of Betty's new flat. So the Metropolitan Police Commissioner is a big mate of her father, Arthur Bevan, who was a sort of medic in Harley Street to the aristocracy. And he goes on, and the police commissioner goes on and says, look what your daughter's doing. And the next morning, Arthur Bevan sits down and writes a letter to Betty, and basically says, you can never come to the house again. The allowance I was going to pay you, now you're divorcing, split up from James, I'm cancelling. You can't talk to your mother. You can't contact your siblings. I think she saw him once again, possibly twice, before he died in the late 1950s. So she's gone, but notwithstanding those personal circumstances, she brings extraordinary energy to the strategic task facing the AIA at this point. In particular, she is key to the organisation with others of the Soho Square exhibition that takes place at the end of the year. She edits 5 on revolutionary art. Herbert Reed had severely criticised the first AIA exhibition in autumn 1934 in a magazine called the London Mercury. This shows her instincts. Her instinct in relation to that criticism is, okay, let's get him in, let's talk to him. So they get him in, they have club rooms by now in Parton Street, they get him in, he talks to the AIA. 3 months later, he's contributing the opening essay to their publication, 5 on revolutionary art. They take 2 townhouses in Soho Square. In one, they have a massive exhibition of art, of 160 odd artists. And in the next one, they have a documentary exhibition of country by country, what is going on in terms of the popular right around Europe and the progress of fascism. The other thing that Betty was central to was writing out to a lot of the key artists that were known, so they're reaching upwards generationally and outwards slightly politically from their originally narrow base focused on being a Comintern organisation. So the international in their title is switched from being a noun, political formation, to being an adjective. And they set up, they broaden out to be the Artists International Association. And in doing that, by the time they have the Soho Square exhibition, they've got Eric Gill, Duncan Grant, Augustus John Laurinaitis, Henry Moore and Paul Nash as the named sponsors alongside them. So they're beginning to come quite a long way. So people like Piper, Lucien Pizarro, remarkable supporter, Lucien Pizarro in his 70s, who had witnessed the division among artists in France during the Dreyfus Affair, and was absolutely committed. He exhibited every possible occasion he did, up to his death in 1944 with the AIA, and was a great encouragement to the younger generation. This, I think, is in a way one of the most remarkable things within that exhibition. So 2 months after the exhibition closes, Laurinaitis becomes the first full woman RA of the modern era. And as you probably know, when you become an RA, you present a piece to the Royal Academy. It's called your diploma piece. the diploma piece she presented was this painting Dawn on the right. It had been exhibited 2 months before at the AIA exhibition. And their achievement, I think, at this point is summed up in a way in these two quotes. The top one is from Kenneth Clark, the director of the National Gallery. It comes from the listener. He'd been appointed 2 years before, patrician to his fingertips, but a shrewd observer of the London art scene. And he's basically saying each group is like a little dissenting sect. And he's thinking of the 7-5 Society, Unit 1, the developing split between the abstract artists and the proto-surrealists that, before the exhibition in 1936, sure of their own salvation while all of the rest of the world is damned. And that, in a sense, chimed with one of the things that the AIA founders were thinking about, because they were worried that ever more obscure modernist experimentation was carrying art further and further away from being something that was communicable to a wider public. But then Montague Slater, very fine journalist and playwright at the time, summing up that Soho Square exhibition, reviewing it, says, "Those whom art politics have put asunder, an exhibition against war and fascism is joined together. It is an excellent achievement." And I think that really sums up what they were doing, because they were encouraging people, notwithstanding their aesthetic beliefs or the particular line of specialism that they were pursuing in art, to actually coalesce behind an agenda that was fundamentally about social and political values at this point. This is by McKnight Kauffer, and it relates to the exhibition that they had in the adjacent townhouse, which is, there's a catalogue in the British Library you can get hold of. It's quite very instructive about how they put together a documentary exhibition at that time. So Rowe and Misha Black and so on, the people involved in designing it and hanging it. It also occurred at the end of the year where possibly it was the last year in which, if you were a thinking person surveying the international scene, you could feel you were wholeheartedly against both fascism and war. In other words, the thinking was that it was possible to defeat fascism without going to war. Cliff Rowe does this painting, I must speed up, which I referred to at the beginning, and in a sense that's the beginning of 1936. It's a political allegory. The clue is Harry's for Quality. Harry Pollitt seen here, the leader of the CP in England. Figures that are reminiscent of Percy Horton's Unemployed Man and the detective from Sedition. These are the founders of the benefactors who led to the foundation of the Marx Memorial Library. Here you have Robert Watson, who becomes the AIA secretary. Cliff is looking on himself. This is probably, I think, Clara Zetkin, but I'm not sure, who had a very different view of what the relationship of art and freedom and politics should be. And here we have, dining alone in the centre, in the dark, is Stalin. And I think it's expressing Cliff's unease. He was in the CP about what was already going on. Felicia Brown is very central to what happened to the AIA during 1936. So she'd been a student at the Slade, very strong feminist, learnt self-defense in the late 1920s, goes off to Berlin, is in a collective of sculptors and metalworkers there, comes back, has an older friend, Elizabeth Bone, who's a journalist. They go off when the Popular Front government is elected to Paris, witness the celebrations there, then go down to Barcelona, where the People's Olympiad is going to be held, which is the counterblast to the Berlin Olympics, the Hitler Olympics. 5,000 people from the Labour movement and Quaker and other strands are assembling there to take part in the Games. Games are due to open on the 20th of July, but on the 15th, the night of the 15th, 16th, it's the beginning of the military revolt that leads to the Spanish Civil War. She ends up enlisting in and 3 weeks later dies in an engagement near Zaragoza. Her drawings are recovered and sent back to London where they are exhibited, and it becomes, the AIA exhibition becomes the first fundraising event for Spanish medical aid. Nan Youngman, who this says her self-portrait there, is a young woman who had not been political up to that point. She was an expert in children's art. She was sitting on a beach in Cornwall, reads about Felicia's death, comes back, goes to the flat where the women in the AIA in particular are organising the Felicia Brown Memorial Exhibition, knocks on the door, and Betty Reed comes to, she's going out to buy Heinz sandwich spread for her boys' tea, comes to the door, and from that moment on, until Betty dies in the mid-1960s, they are a couple, and an extremely impressive couple who do some rather amazing things. Nan Youngman, in particular, is behind the Pictures for Schools scheme. She's a considerable artist, and we'll have lots of her work at the Towner, and lots of Betty's sculpture, because Betty goes back after the war and her political activism to being a very considerable figurative sculptor in the 50s, and is a key person behind an exhibition called Looking at People, that begins at the Whitworth, comes down to London, and then goes off to Moscow in the 50s. So the Artists' Congress took a lot of its inspiration in 1937 from what was going on in the US, where the New Deal is leading to the employment of lots of artists at that time on the public payroll, and they were a considerable inspiration to the Artists' Congress here, which was focused on what should we be doing across the full range of what should the state be doing, what should museums be doing, how should we be teaching children art, and so on. At the exhibition accompanying the Artists' Congress, it was the first London exhibition of the Pitman painters. They took this big mansion in Grosvenor Square, and the Pitman painters from the coalfields in Northumberland were there. They are becoming much clearer about how to use publicity. So this picture appeared all over the provincial press in the run-up to the Congress, which was also advertised a lot in the letters, columns, and papers. So you have Roland Penrose, Paul Nash, Henry Moore, and Naomi Durrell choosing the surrealist work that goes in. But this publicity, now well organised, also alerts the right-wing press. Red Gary of Art Horrors insulting the Union Jack. The landowner is the Duke of Westminster, who manages to find a clause in the lease that forces them to move the Artists' Congress to the Conway Hall, although the exhibition carries on in Grosvenor Square. And here we have Quentin Bell delivering the Education Commission report. One of the paintings that was in that exhibition is this one of Vanessa Bell, which I think is quite interesting in that it is just before the event, I mean, the event that really cruelled the rest of her life, the death of her son Julian as an ambulance driver. Soon after the Congress, Elizabeth Watson, Quentin Bell, Duncan Grant, Vanessa Bell go off to Paris, in fact, having just said goodbye to Julian, who's going off to Spain. She goes in, she sees Gernika coming together, and says something particularly evil. She's obviously thinking about her son in Spain, and very soon after, he is killed there. Picasso promises to turn up at an Albert Hall rally where Professor Constable was one of the headliners. Picasso didn't actually turn up, but Paul Robeson, learning that the British authorities were not going to allow him to broadcast to the Congress, to the meeting in the Albert Hall from Moscow, flew back and appeared in the hall. It was obviously an absolutely great moment for people. The Whitechapel exhibition took place in 1935 in a very different atmosphere. Already the effects of appeasement were beginning to really demoralize people. There had been the Modern German Art exhibition, which the AIA had been party to organising, very much linked also at the time to Spain, which was the sort of coming out party in London for German expressionism in a way. But what was happening in Spain was shifting from arms from Spain and medical aid to send food aid as the Republic collapsed. And the AIA got, I think it's 30 billboards from the London County Council and did live painting on 9 of them in this is Kerry Richards' as part of that party. The campaign to send food aid was also benefited from the fact that as Chamberlain was flying back from Munich to declare peace for our time as he got out of the airport, Gernika was arriving rolled up in the hold of a ship at Tilbury. It's put on display in central London, then goes up to Manchester and comes back and is displayed in the week or two before the exhibition at the Whitechapel Art Gallery as part of the Food Ships for Spain campaign. They've by now set up a quite heavy-hitting advisory council as part of their progress. There's Misha Black in the background of Revilius, Percy Horton and Edward Borden selecting things to go into the show at Whitechapel, which had some very considerable art in it. I haven't got time to go into all the things that they managed to achieve. It is remarkable that they keep this organisation going and growing during the war from a voluntary base. They do some remarkable things in terms of travelling exhibitions, work with the exile communities, still keeping their major exhibitions going, and the debate about what artists should be doing in civil society before having this exhibition in Oxford Street on the John Lewis bomb site, which was really dramatised. It was the point of the war where people were beginning to think, we're going to win this. What's the post-war world going to be like? And it was the two competing visions, a return to the old social order, or are we actually going to have health centres that are going to deal with health conditions? So Frank Newbold on the left and Abraham Games on the right. A man called F.H.K. Henry was a very good designer, extremely influential in the crafting of this exhibition. He was also working for the American Office of War Information in Mayfair at the same time as he was working for the Ministry of Information. And he was instrumental in them adopting the four freedoms of the Atlantic Charter as the key organising principle at the centre of this exhibition, remarkable exhibition. Harry Atkinson is here tonight, who's made with the Four Corners Collective, a very considerable film about this exhibition. I just want to finish on looking at a couple of things. This painting here, which is called The Death of Gabriel Perry, this was the central room where they had works of art that were illustrating those four freedoms in various ways. So Kokoschka, who was an important intermediary between the exile community and the IRA, exhibited this painting, which is now in Zurich. But this one is called The Death of Gabriel Perry. And it's exhibited there, as you can see. Gabriel Perry was a very fine journalist. He was the foreign editor of Humanité, the Guardian equivalent in Paris in the 30s. He was also an elected member of the National Assembly. When the Germans got to Paris, he went underground and continued to produce his journalism in Samizdat form. And this is a pamphlet that was subsequently written in London by William Rust, the Daily Worker, because he was either betrayed or the Germans got lucky. He was caught, he was taken to Fort Valérien on the outskirts of Paris, and then given literally 2 hours' notice he was going to be shot as a hostage, in which he composed this final letter, which was smuggled out and came here, and not surprisingly, he became something of a hero for the exile community in London. Another painting there, which is by Maurice Kesselman, who was of Jewish heritage but not at all religious. In fact, he rejected religion on rationalist grounds in his youth. So you can't find anything other than this in his work that has direct references to that Jewish heritage. But clearly there were people in London who were beginning to comprehend the full extent of the horror of the Holocaust, and people who saw this painting at that exhibition write about it and its emotional impact. It will be at the Tower next year. It's in the Imperial War Museum. But it was also an exhibition that was looking forward to their hopes of what would happen in the period of Reconstruction. This one by John Tarr, called Focal Point, and was accompanied by lines from a Cecil Day-Lewis poem. The future poet laureate was working with these guys at the Ministry of Information at the time. And the penultimate line was of his poem that he wrote, having seen all these paintings, and it was used as the strapline beneath the paintings, a pattern mysterious yet lucid, for love is the focal point of the pattern. And the final line was about this, which was by Betty Reed. Betty and Nan were looking after evacuated children in East Anglia, and that was the final line of the poem. This was terracotta. It exists in bronze form in a back garden in North London, and we're able to borrow it next year on condition we clean it. So it will be at the Tower. Just to talk about the Tower exhibition, if you are able to come to it next year, what we're doing is we're taking 11 of the lesser known artists, but who were absolutely central to this story and are, in my view, all very fine in their own particular ways. If you go to it, you'll get a rounded sense of their life and art, as well as their activism and their participation in the AA. And then we will have one or two works of the great and the good who surrounded them and became their key supporters. And there will be a substantial accompanying program of talks and seminars, and if any of you people would like to contribute to it, talk to us. We also hope that we'll have some solidarity with Ukraine cultural institutions. There's some activities mounted on the back of that exhibition, because we are, that's Peter Laszlo Perry work that will be there, because we are hoping that that painting I showed you that Cliff Rowe did, which has been discovered in the National Gallery of Ukraine in Lviv, long story about how it got there, will actually be coming to this country as part of next year's exhibition. Just very, very finally, the question, Steve referred to the exhibition at the Tate. The question of why so submerged in those art of the last 40 years in academic in British art history, I think it's partly academia. I'm astounded at the number of monographs and biographies that are written about these people that one can evidence were on the central committee of this organisation or were key supporters. That you will find, you'll be lucky if you find half a paragraph about their political engagement. I think institutions are often run scared about things that speak to class dynamics, power, and inequality. They've got very used to acknowledging gender and issues to do with race and racism. But I've got personal experience about how gun-shy they are when you try and raise issues that speak to class politics. And there is also something about the archival record. One of the things that I discovered when putting together the Tate thing was this minute book. It's the record of 60 meetings of the AA Central Committee that took place between the week before Munich and the beginning of the first phase of the Blitz. And what it shows in two meetings is that soon after Dunkirk, when most people in London were expecting a German invasion, and a lot of those most people were expecting it might succeed, that they met and decided to destroy a lot of their records, which would have enabled the Gestapo to basically take out the London left had they got to London. So I think and that is why, if you get, the AA went on to 1971, when it closed down, its records went to the Tate, where they exist in a lot of cardboard boxes. And you can work out from those records what the AA spent on postage stamps in 1941, because the checkbook stubs are there. But what you can't do is get a full run of, for example, the over 100 bulletins they put out during the 1930s that evidence their activity. And this very, very considerable achievement from a standing start, people who, with zero resources, but their hearts in the right place, and an intelligent engagement with the sort of drumbeat of history that was unfolding around them, built this very, very significant organisation. So thank you so much for being such a patient.